What's up, Folsom? Today we have a special treat for you as we talk about peacemaking, but with a lot of leaders in our city. Brian,
incredible people.
Who all do we have on this podcast?
We have Brannon from Jesus Culture. We have Brian, the new Brian in Folsom.
The other Brian
from
in Folsom.
Lakeside.
Yep.
All the sides getting together.
You had the two of us.
The two of us.
You had Lisa Thompson, women's pastor at Bayside, Granite Bay, and you had Lorraine Rothenberg, who's been a pastor in Folsom for 26 years. So today, as the leaders of Folsom in our city, we talk about what it looks like to be peacemakers in the world who are seen as the children of God. Check this out. Guys, thanks so much for joining us today for this discussion. As you all know, we've discussed this off camera, that our series at Bayside Folsom, we've been having this conversation around peace. And we've been walking through the Good Samaritan, said robbers were peace breakers. The motto for them was me at all cost. And then we had the conversation of peace fakers, the idea of perception at all cost with the Levite and the priest. And then we get to the very end of the story and the Samaritan himself, the least likely person Jesus would ever bring up in the room that he's in, is the peacemaker. Going across all different cultural lines, history, different wars have been. I mean, this is as flagrant as he can make an example of saying the person you don't think should be in the blank of the good blank, he goes to Samaritan. Would have paused the room. And we see this peacemaker identity in what this Samaritan does. So we've been referencing this idea of this story tells, like this goes through story form to kind of put that beatitude on display. That blessed are the peacemakers, because the peacemakers are seen and known and called the children of God. So we said, who would we want to have a conversation with about making peace? And having conversations of peace and societal and church and all of those things. We're like, well, if we got a bunch of different leaders from one city, our city, where all our churches are in, where we've been for a long time, and have this discussion of peace. So thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
But as our listeners now know, we are completely unscripted on this. So there's not an intro. There's not, hey, here's a nice thought-provoking, probing question. We wanted to have, we base this set like a living room on purpose. So this idea of we're in a living room together. Thoughts on peace, and let's see where the conversation takes us. May the Lord be with us. Who likes to go first?
Who wants to go first? Nobody wants to go first on this stuff. It's interesting you guys you're talking about peace, because even the story, we live in a world right now. It's interesting because as you read scripture and as you look at culture, it becomes more like, I think the Bible was written for the exact moment we're in right now. Maybe in all of history, I'm sure that everybody could say the same thing, but you just look around, you're like, this is the amount of division, the amount of conflict, the amount of families torn apart, but also just practically speaking, how much work what you're describing is.
Right.
When you're like, blessed are the peacemakers, you're like, dude, it is so much work.
Yes.
Like it's not.
Yes.
And it's not just avoiding, like I'm just going to avoid all of this. Like to actually wade into those situations that require peace.
Yeah.
Like it takes a level of intentionality that I'm not sure, and so many people are exhausted.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it just takes so much, family,
Yes.
all of it, not just,
doubt.
in the city, but actually just in family, whatever else. So I'm struck by the fact when you're saying that right now, I'm like, that's a lot of work.
Yes.
Even what Jesus calls us to.
100%.
Well, and when you think about the difference between a peacekeeper and a peacemaker, so often a peacekeeper wants to avoid conflict, wants to avoid.
Are you saying there's something wrong with that?
Our-
Because that sounds amazing.
Stay out of it,
wants
please.
to avoid the mess, wants to,
Yes.
whereas a peacemaker steps into the conflict, steps into what's hard. And it takes great intentionality to do that, and risk. When you look at this story, I mean, it was risky for this Samaritan to step in to help this man. There's robbers on the road.
Right.
May still be on the road. There's perhaps other Jewish people around that are that would consider
Without a
him
doubt,
an
there
enemy.
were.
And so, but I think so often, I know for me anyway, I settle for peacekeeping, which is, more I'm just going to sit back and watch and let somebody else get messy, wade into what's hard.
Yeah, like we talked about this a lot, this discussion of, by definition, you only go make peace where peace isn't. Like, so there's not this idea of you can't peacemake in harmonious moments. You can't peacemake where peace already is. And we chatted about that before, like this idea that if you were trying to boil down peacemaking to a word, which is impossible, hear me, like what a gross exaggeration. But sacrifice being the word, that it would actually cost one something to make peace.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, our case in point would be you have peace with God out of Jesus' sacrifice. But then we think we toss some like historical examples up of Catherine of Alexandria, Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr. These are sacrifice-ridden stories.
Kidding.
Yeah.
Often to like the fullest end of what sacrifice is, to be a part of making the ultimate peace, being known as the children of God in the world. But other thoughts?
I love what you said, Lorraine, about the peacekeeping. I grew up in a divorced family, and so a lot of conflict between my mom and dad.
Yeah.
And as a kid, I learned quickly that peacekeeping was the ultimate way to navigate hostility between two people. But as I've grown in my relationship with God, I've come to peace with my circumstances, with my divorce, and not allow that to define my state of peace. I've been able to sit in those places now from a place of peace, peacemaking, because only Jesus can make peace.
Yeah.
We have to be at peace through the Holy Spirit to be able to sit with others in their conflict and in their brokenness and in their disappointment of how life has, robbed them of that, the way that sin robs us of that.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where God has taken something that the enemy meant for evil, divorce, conflict, dysfunction, part of my life story, and just said, you know what? You're going to use this for good because you understand brokenness.
Yeah.
You can sit in both places, but you're not the one that's going to fix these places. Only I can do that. So you bring me, the peacemaker, into these these relationships.
Yeah.
I think of we've heard of sins of omission and sins of commission, and with this parable, we have this opt out. Where the priest and Levite, they didn't rob anybody.
Nope.
They didn't hurt anybody.
Nope.
They weren't dropping elbows on this guy.
Right.
They just simply said, I'm gonna opt out. And just keep doing my thing. And I think that's so easy for us because it's so tiring. We hear of compassion fatigue.
Yes.
We look at all the problems in the world, and I've got mine. God's the God of peace. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. I'm not. So you go do it, God. You're the God of peace. I'm messed up, or I'm tired. So I'm not going to go hate on anybody. I'm not going to go jump anybody on the road, but I'm also not going to enter into because I just don't have what it takes. But I think this reminder that we can believe in God but be far from God, right? Like we can like have a theology of God, but it's this idea of you can have the peace of God when you have peace with God.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
sometimes you can theologically, I have peace with God, like I'm made right with Christ.
Right.
But you have to like intentionally make that connection of I'm empowered by God to do this. So I may be tired, but I've been entrusted. There's a responsibility. I think of like the parable of the talents. Like that guy buried it in the ground. He opted out.
Right.
Yeah.
He's like, I'm not going to go do what I've been entrusted to do. I'm going to opt out. And this tiring idea of peacemaking, there's a lot of opt out.
Yes.
And if the church opts out, well, in our society, where is that peace? And the problem is like, this is just real life. So we can say we should do this, but we can also say we're tired.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so what does it mean to experience the peace with God so that we can have the peace of God? That's that tension that just in everyday life, I think we face.
Yeah.
And I think that's lived out in the context of community, the church. The world looks at the church to see, well, what does this peace look like? What does it look like to be right with God and right with your neighbor? And I think COVID showed us we're not doing so good.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can't, like the Good Samaritan who had, been condemned and marginalized by the Jews at the time. he went out of his way to make peace with an enemy because they had a difference of opinion. They had different theologies. They had different ideas. And I think for us as a church, this is what the world is looking. If we can't get this right, then that idea of them being right with God is going to be confusing.
I think at some level, and we won't fully unpack it here, but if you're going to be a peacemaker, you probably have to define peace, what we're talking about there. But at some level, that concept of what you're talking about, peacekeeping, which is at some level just lack of conflict. Like the goal is no conflict.
Right.
Like the goal is just no conflict,
Avoid.
which really isn't peace. It's not the real definition of, like, peace is way more connected to connection and relationship and unity and coming together. So the concept, though, sometimes for us is, hey, well, I have peace because you live over there and I live over here. So the goal is just like, well, we don't interact.
Coexistence.
And listen, we're pastors. We know marriages that, like, well, I live in that, you live, here's why we don't have conflict. Because we just live over there and I live over here. We do two separate lives. You're like, well, that's not really peace.
Right.
It's a false definition of peace.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think that that we do have to kind of go, oh no, peace, biblical peace.
Yes.
Is way more. It's what you're talking. Like, well, I just is way more moving towards people. It's way more figuring out what real connection and relationship and unity looks like. I think in all this type of stuff, we're pastors, so we would get this. All of us would, I think, be able to define that. Would be able to say this about our church. Dream scenario. Every single person has taken ownership for the call of God on their life and is fully engaged in that call. Right? We look around and say, we would change the world.
Yes, please.
And change our city if every single person, or the majority of them. There's going to be a lot of new young believers, new believers, non-believers. The majority of the church is fully engaged. I say that because I think that peacemakers, it takes a deep sense of ownership that says, I am in the earth to represent Jesus. And everywhere I go, God has called me there to bring peace. In my home, at my workplace, at the gym, wherever I go, God's put me there. And I think sometimes we can look at, honestly, even the conflict in Israel and what's happening with politics, and we get so overwhelmed with all of it and miss, I think, the point of, oh, if I really just took ownership for the call of God on my life and said, exactly where God has me, I am there to bring peace. And what does that look like? And I can't bring peace everywhere.
That's right.
I even though that's what's all flooding at me, I'm overwhelmed by all of this, but I can do something about this. And if every single one of the people that sat in our church actually showed up to work every day thinking, I'm here to bring peace. What does that actually look like?
Dude, one, cut the podcast. That's great. That's perfect. We're done. All thoughts.
Shut it down.
Perfect. I would double down on all those things. Like, let's quote Mother Teresa. Let's go Calcutta for a second. She says two things that are doubling down exactly on what Banning is saying. One, she says, if we do not have peace, it is because we have forgotten we belong to each other. And I love that. And then she goes, and if you want to change the world, go home and love your family. And I think that's an amazing idea that, like, it does feel so overwhelming. Like, you're living in the only time in history where your phone buzzes every hour of the day with global news.
Telling you how much not peace is out there.
Exactly.
Telling you how much division and conflict there is.
It's nuts, and the weight of all of it. And I love that kind of subtle call back of, no, like, changing the world feels like trying to boil the ocean when you've been, like, called to heat the coffee kettle up. And the idea of, if you want to change the world, like, be a part of peacemaking in yours. Go home and love your family. Where the places and spaces in which you dwell, go to those places to make peace. I find it interesting in the passage, Jesus says, because the guy gives all the right theology answers. He passes the test, right? He talks about love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Like, he quotes all the right things. He says all the right things. And Jesus says this really weird, interesting line. He says, great, right answer. Do this and you will live. And that word live actually means thrive by design. Like, no, that is actually optimal human peace with God, flowing out of that into the world.
John 10:10, abundant life.
Abundant life.
That's it.
But if you do that, not you're going to get just eternal life, but like, no, do that and you will live.
Yeah.
By design, thriving.
Yes.
Yeah.
Lisa.
I'd like to pose a question off of what Banning said.
Yes.
This idea of we've been called to bring peace,
Yeah.
but if we're not at peace,
Yep.
if we're not reconciled, if we're not, understanding the fullness of what God has done for us, walking in his forgiveness, his grace, and all of that, it's hard. It's an inauthentic expression. It's not the fullness of that. So how do we move people? How do we disciple people? How do we help people get to that place? You can't bring peace until you know peace. And I think sometimes I think out of COVID, I was like, oh, interesting. We're not as developed in this idea coming out of COVID that I thought maybe our efforts had done.
Yeah.
So that's kind
An
of
under-discipled
Yeah.
community and
Yeah. So
under-discipled,
I'd love
which I
to
think
know-
gets to, doesn't it get to identity?
Yeah.
Right? A misunderstanding of who we are. I'm stealing your answer here, Brandon.
Oh, no. You're
Children of God, sons and daughters of the
Absolutely.
Most High God.
Yeah.
If we misunderstand that, there's no chance at peace, frankly.
I think we settle for far less. As one of the things I'm fascinated by is how much as believers we settle for far less than what the cross actually purchased.
1,000%.
So good.
And so I think it's some
Say that
level,
again. Say it again. No,
well,
literally.
I think that we settle for far less than what the cross purchased. And I think this thing, when you really look at it, so salvation, the iniquities and sins were on him, but the chastisement for our peace.
Yeah.
And I just think if we can get believers going, peace is your actual inheritance. It's
Yes.
your actual family right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like when you became a child of God,
Yes.
Yeah.
then what was purchased for you is peace. And it does feel like we kind of accept
Yeah.
way less.
Yeah.
Preach.
Right.
And I think at some level, when we say we want to go be peacemakers, we are trying to bring what Jesus purchased for people,
Yeah.
which was peace.
Right.
Yeah.
It was part of the atonement.
Yeah.
That's
Like
right.
peace is actually part of the atonement. I need to have it in my life, and then I just need to bring it into situations. But it's interesting for me because I just think we do. We settle for there's not something in us that goes, I want
Yeah.
everything that was purchased.
Yes.
Not arrogantly. I actually think it's the most grateful thing you can do
Yeah.
is actually receive everything
All
that
of
was
it.
purchased.
Yeah.
Well said.
And so that concept of it's just part of the atonement.
Yeah, I forget which theologian coined this phrase, but this idea of the shrunken gospel,
Yeah.
where we
There you go.
reduce our identity of what the gospel is, of like getting to heaven someday. And in the meantime, it's that bury ourselves in the ground. It's the opt out. It's just hold on till Jesus comes. Pretty poor theology.
Yeah.
But we really hold on.
And
to
no
that.
wonder we're not bringing peace
That's
into
exactly right.
seriously.
Right.
Yeah.
It's this, at least I'm saved.
Yes.
Yeah.
At least
Well
Jesus
said.
forgave my sin.
Yep.
But between here and there,
There's
I'm
so
just
much
trying to
more.
make it. Yeah.
Yes.
And we reduce what the cross has purchased. And if we can just get a glimpse of this John 10:10 life, this thriving life,
Yeah.
there's something alive that we don't just, I guess I will give peace, but I get to.
Yeah.
I'm able to because the Holy Spirit is in me. Romans 15:13, one of my favorite kind of benediction scriptures. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope. It's through this connection,
Yes.
not just this theology. It's not,
That's
well, I
right.
believe Jesus is the Son of God. Good. But now live it out
Right.
so that this working out can fill you with hope. This is the good life.
Yes.
Yes.
This is what we've been invited into.
Dallas Willard is one of those people who talks about the gospel of sin management and trying that it's about not doing naughty things.
Yeah. Yep.
And also the idea of vampire Christianity, that we are just interested in the blood of Christ to cover our sin, but not necessarily in a relationship with him that undoes us, that reforms us into who he intends for us to be.
Yep.
And when you think about peace, like as you were talking about it, I was thinking about this concept of shalom
that's
and
it right
this flourishing that we should desire
Flourishing.
for one another, that we are agents of shalom, that everywhere we go, we are to bring the fragrance of Christ. And so that Jesus looks attractive to people.
Yeah.
instead of, and COVID was such a challenging time because people were so at odds with each other, even inside our churches. And how
Not ours.
No
one around this circle.
What church were you a part of? This is
This
is awkward.
Oh man.
It was smooth sailing for us, Lorraine.
And it's like we were in the fire.
Never been better.
We were in the fire, and how do we come out not stinking like smoke?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And but to desire the flourishing of not just ourselves, but of another.
Yeah.
Remembering that we are image bearers, like at the most base level, that we are all human beings, living this human life, then can cause us to move toward people that are unlike us, people that we're not going to benefit from, that can't necessarily do something for us.
Yeah.
Yes.
But we recognize the opportunity to pour Christ into them, to be Jesus with skin on to them.
Yeah.
And so then we actually put teeth to what we call peace. It's not just absence of conflict.
Yeah.
It's flourishing and desiring the well-being of another, because we are creatures of God.
Well said. I think to that question too, that point of discipling our people as we do this ourselves. I mean, I say it's a lot at our church that my preaching philosophy is preach at me, and in God's goodness, He'll do something with you. So I think obviously on the mirror on us first. But I say it's a lot in my own spiritual journey. I don't know if maybe you would relate to this in kind of that Western evangelical 90s, 2000s kid growing up in that world, which had a lot of beauty in it for sure. Don't hear me saying that it was all for naught. It was not. But I remember saying by the time I got to seminary that I had been taught to study and obey.
Yes.
And I don't think anyone ever even taught me how to pray.
Yep.
I'd been taught. I had I use this on purpose. Like I had a disciple mentality, like a mathetes, like I had the adherent of the way.
Yeah.
That was my entire concept of life with God.
Read and do.
Read and do. And obviously, this is the whole parable's issue, right? The guy is asking, "What must I do to inherit?" Like that's the premise.
Yep.
And to Brian's point, I find it so interesting that it's in moments like that mount that day as he's giving those beatitudes that he says children of God on purpose.
Literally.
That I think I feel that chief burden, and some of that's out of my own pain and story, but like some of that chief burden is discipling our people to their actual identity.
Yeah.
Like they are disciples of Jesus.
Yeah.
They are to be adherents of the way, absolutely. Read and study, do those things, go about teaching others. I find that interesting that as he's sending the disciples out in the Great Commission, like he's telling them, make disciples. I just think it's really important we remember as ministers that that's the only thing we can make.
No kidding.
Like you can make disciples, you can teach people to study and obey.
Yep.
And obey all that he said as you're charged to do so. You just can't make children of God.
No kidding.
Like only Jesus can.
Well, you're describing at some level the difference between Western and Eastern education,
Well
in
said.
that at some level we have viewed discipleship
Yes.
as a classroom concept.
Yeah.
That's right.
When ultimately discipleship is a family concept.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well
It's
said.
about reproducing. It's
Yes.
about the DNA.
Yes.
Where in our concept of discipleship, I put you in a room, I teach you
Yep.
concepts I know, you now have those concepts, which is not even close
No
to
way.
the biblical definition of discipleship.
Precisely.
So at some level,
Yep.
it is just like this classroom education concept rather than, and we all know this, but what Jesus just such a different, he's just walking for miles, sitting
Right.
around things. It's like doing
Yes.
life together and sharing, and even they're wanting to pray like him. It's because they were sitting there watching him pray.
That's right.
They're literally just there, and just Jesus is gone in the morning. They're watching him pray. They're like, I want to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that
Precisely.
ultimately, the discipleship piece.
Yeah.
It's one reason why we've got to bring people in our homes if we're really going to disciple them, and that's where I think they're going to find out whether we walk in peace or not,
Oh man.
whether or not we actually,
Yes.
how we handle conflict and how we bring stuff. But
well said.
Even just thinking of our community and our churches and congregants, interacting every day at Target and Walmart and Starbucks and Pete's and all those places. If we fully knew in these places that we stepped into that we carried the shalom of peace, that changes without saying a word, without preaching a word, without letting our deeds be known. Just the power of the presence of God and the Spirit can change an atmosphere.
Yes.
And collectively, the unity of each other, bringing that into our community, that's how we transform.
Lisa, will you get real granular for a second? Like with that shalom, when we step into those places, what actually does it look like day in and day out to bring that peace? Like what are the, again, I don't want to turn it into a go and do thing, but
I think it's kind
what
of
does it look like?
It is a go and do. It's a represent Jesus. I do think that we're called to represent Jesus in the world and be Jesus in the world. So it's just who we are. It's out of identity though.
Yes.
I think the do is a problem when it's
just a do.
When it's not coming from just who I am.
Yeah.
I think Brian said parable of the talents. Are you going to sit on the peace, hide the peace, or are you going to go and be the peace?
Yeah.
And I think it's, it's a kingdom mindset. It's getting our people on mission. They're part of something bigger than themselves, their circumstances, and how we're, training up and teaching and discipling people to be part of that, not just Sunday, not just Wednesday, but tomorrow morning, when you head into your school and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think, like when we're going into Target, this may seem just too ethereal, but like we are carriers of the kingdom into Target. So we're not going to see the latest, whatever my wife wants to go see or my girls want to see, which is often constant Target trips.
Yes.
We're not just going
We're only getting a few things there.
No, never.
But we're carriers of the kingdom. So if our mindset as followers of Jesus is simply, I'm going to the store to get what I need for my family, then we are isolating ourselves from bringing anything else to it.
Yeah.
So if we're walking into a store, it's not this extravagant thing, but it's just who are we and what are we doing? So the simplicity of like smile often.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean fake it till you make it. It doesn't mean you just pretend everything's great.
Yeah.
But the reality is we walk in a society, whether it's at the Palladio or whether it's down in Historic, two different ends of the city, people are still walking around without any expression on their face.
Yeah.
We live in a society of downcast eyes and monotone faces, and we are to bring something into that. There should be something different. Again, not because we're pretending that everything's fine, but there is a joy unspeakable. There is a peace that passes understanding. So the identity of even going into a store, getting a little granular, it's bringing up a conversation rather than avoiding conversation. It's this whole idea, welcome mats at houses these days. There's funny welcome mats that are like, do not knock. We are pretending to not be here. Like people don't want people to be at their house. When people knock,
where can I buy that?
We're like, turn off the lights. Turn off the lights. Act like we're not here.
Our house is a fortress, an impenetrable fortress.
That's right, and that's super normal. Like we all feel that. That's a natural
Not
reaction.
in the South, it's not, man.
There we go. Okay.
Every time I go to the South, I'm like, put some fences up in your backyard, please.
And lock your door.
This is
Lock
lock
the
your door.
Yeah. This may not translate to the South, but
in Folsom,
over here,
dang true.
There's just a reality.
That's right.
That, of we are trying to resist that gravitational pull to bury what we've been called to carry.
Yeah.
And so even with our facial expressions and engagement, it's taking a step and allowing the Holy Spirit to lead us into whatever's next.
And here's where go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you teed that up so beautifully because I had this example in my head, and then you mentioned Target.
It's
always
a powerful
Target.
It's
concept.
always Target. Yeah.
Are we having the Target conversation right now?
I can't. I'll be
Are we
triggered.
going there?
I can't
Oh, your
talk
family
about
goes
it.
to Target, huh? That's interesting.
From a granular level, I was in line at the Target in Folsom, and the guy in front of me was ripping into the cashier.
Oh,
a young gal, And I'm not even sure what all he was upset about.
She owns Target. That's why he was so mad. She owns Target and really could make some decisions.
Right, exactly. And he just went off
so
on her.
Uncomfortable, isn't it?
And to the point, and she just didn't say anything, to the point where he finally just said, that's it. I'm leaving all my stuff here on the counter, and I'm not going to shop here anymore. And he stormed out. He was loud enough for everybody to hear. And I'm right behind her. And so then I have a choice of what am I going to do? And so it was an opportunity for me to breathe some peace into this girl, and just to say, I just want you to know that I feel like you handled that really well, and that was super unfair that happened to you, and I'm really sorry. I mean, it's having our eyes wide open to bind up the wounds when we encounter them, because they're always around us. I walked by a lady in a coffee place reading obituaries one day, and I could tell she was really sad, and I stopped, and how God just compels you to and I said, "Are you doing okay? I noticed you're reading the obituary." "No, I just lost someone." And just open this conversation for me to, we just have to pull up a chair alongside people, literally or figuratively. And I think a lot of it is we have to not just look, we have to see.
Say it.
When I volunteered as a chaplain for law enforcement, which is still one of those things, like, what was I thinking? Because that's really hard. And they teach you how to look without seeing, so you're not overwhelmed by the blood you see at a crime scene, or the just the hard stuff, which is appropriate for that context. But when it comes to the victims, the witnesses, then you have to not just look, you have to see. And so when we're out and about, or even in our family, to be able to not just look and assess, but to also see to the point that we take action is peacemaking. And it takes time. We can't be living on the ragged edge. We've got to have margin in our life to where we can stop and have a conversation with someone that needs to have their wounds bound up, just needs to be able to see. I told one homeless guy, "I'm sorry I don't have any money, but I just want to tell you, I see you." Because I know, and I'm one of them, people drive by and they don't want to look at you.
Absolutely.
And I am often one of those people, even people I know, like at Rayleigh's or whatever, sometimes I don't have the capacity, and and there's something about just stopping and particularizing a person. Jesus was so good at this, when he went to the woman at the well in Samaria, and the woman with the issue of blood. Just when we particularize someone and we give them the gift of peace, because we know the peacemaker, because he lives in us, we can be a peace. We know the peace giver, then we can be a peacemaker, and have our eyes wide open throughout our day. When our feet hit the floor, we're on mission. And to be used, to be willing and available, however God wants to pour us out, because what else, are we here for?
Well, and I think for the church, for all of us, this is a battle of indifference. The parable of the Good Samaritan, these Levites and these priests, they didn't do anything bad, they were just indifferent. And I think it's George Bernard Shaw. I'm gonna just mess up this quote. So Google it.
Do it.
No. The greatest sin against humanity is not hate; it's indifference. When we just don't care about our neighbor. And that is so easy to do because we have our own lives, we have our own friends, our own family, our own shopping list, and the battle that we all have to just wrestle with is how indifferent am I to those on the outside of my bubble. And if we can at least just wrestle with indifference and where we're at with that, so that we can actually see people and look and go, okay, I'm not going to live indifferent. I'm going to look for the cash register or the obituaries versus the opt-out. It's not my problem. It's not my responsibility because they're not in my bubble. Well, Jesus obviously went out of his way and told stories of what it means to go to those places.
Here's where I'm going to turn left and ruin our conversation. I don't think we can actually do all this stuff on social media. And here's actually why I bring this up, because when you're talking about like we're supposed to come into situations, when you're talking about the discipleship issue, and I know that I mean, even as we talk about peace, at some level, the cultural aspect of people living on social media, people interacting digitally rather than in person.
Yes.
I think for a couple reasons. One is this: I just think that I just like, go put all that down and just go walk with people.
Precisely.
Like, you can't actually be a peacemaker.
Yep.
Right.
This is a really big statement that maybe I don't fully believe, but you can't be a peacemaker on a keyboard. You can't.
No.
Like, you actually have to be in flesh with people, and that's why the responsibility of exactly where you are is where you're supposed to be, and spend most of your energy.
Yes.
You can
doing
have peace
your
hot
world.
takes on
Yes.
social media.
No.
You can't be
Bridging the incarnational divide. That's what it does.
Yes.
They bridge the incarnational
Yes.
divide
No.
with skin on, with people.
And I think if we're going to call people to be peacemakers, we have to address the thing of like a lot of their interaction and a lot of their time
It's on a screen.
is spent with people not actually face to face.
Yeah,
And I'm
that's
like,
well
no,
said.
we've got to go the opposite of that, and we got to go face to face, and that's what they're there for. But the second thing about social media that's interesting for me is, you mentioned the discipleship issue. And you mentioned if you don't have peace, I think that we really have to teach people what is stealing their peace.
Yeah, the robbing.
Like they're getting their peace is getting stolen from them.
Yes.
We had somebody disciple us for years, and she actually mentioned this thing of, whenever you've lost your peace, stop and go, where did I drop it? And I'll do that consistently. I'll be like, dude, I just feel turmoil. Oh, what's going on? I feel, and I'll just stop and I'll be like, oh, it's that conversation I had.
Yes.
Or, oh, it's social media.
Right.
Oh, I got on Twitter.
Yep.
Yeah.
And, or
Can
I
we
got
back up for a second?
Yeah.
It's the conversation I had, or the conversation I didn't
Yes,
have.
both. The things I'm avoiding, the conversation, absolutely. And actually teaching people, how do you actually live in a place of peace,
Yeah.
so that we can go into places and bring peace.
Right.
It's a little bit like, well, I'm drowning, and then you're asking me to save that other guy who's drowning.
Yeah.
Well said.
And
Yep.
we're like, no. So I think actually discipling people, it's why I bring up social media. I think social media is one of the biggest peace stealers.
God, yes.
It just is.
Right.
The amount of people I
That's
talk
why
to
I
this,
quit 3 years ago.
Yeah,
I quit 3 years ago. Don't
Okay.
even have it. Don't own it.
Well, this
don't
is
look
what's
at it.
fascinating is I'll talk to people, and I'm not even anti whatever. I
No,
just am.
I'm not.
I'm anti people not recognizing
Yes.
when something's actually affecting them negatively.
Yes.
Just because it's a part of this society.
Yeah.
But I'll talk to people. They're like, oh, I just went 30 days. I went 30 days off social media. I'm like, how was it? They're like, oh, I just felt so good. They're like, just was so much peace. Felt so great. It was just wonderful. I'm back on it. And, but it,
I relapsed.
yeah, but it's fascinating to me because we really are. This is an interesting thing as pastors that we should talk about. We're calling people to be peacemakers who aren't actually walking themselves in peace.
Sure.
I think there's peace seekers, right? There's still people in the church that are seeking peace outside of a relationship with Jesus. So they're looking to identity on social media. They're looking to their degrees, how well they're doing, their achievements, their money, and all these
Every
things.
unhealthy coping mechanism out there.
Every
yes.
unhealthy so when those turn upside down, what comes out is not peace, right? And so I think the opportunity often in our difficulties is to show people, I'm going through this hard season, health season, financial season, marital season, but I'm still walking in peace. Instead of get me through it, get me to the end of it, pray it away. Yes, we want God to work, but he's also using sometimes those places to showcase what peace looks like. It's not when everything ducks are in a row and life is good and money's in the bank and your weight's down on the scale. It's actually just the opposite. And so how do we, I think, become more vulnerable and authentic where people can kind of see our lives that aren't perfect or messy, but we're tapping into the Prince of Peace, and we walk that shalom out as we walk into Target to serve people, because it helps us forget about what's robbing us of peace. That intentionality that you said.
We've ended every conversation on this podcast with one type of topic that's a roundhouse kick. Everybody takes a swing at it. And Brian, you said, I don't know how many minutes ago it was, but you used the phrase compassion fatigue.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty convinced in this story, there's these kind of three things you really clearly see that Jesus points out in this peacemaking Samaritan who sacrifices, steps into it, sees. But the first thing he says is he saw him there. That's the first thing. Like, Jesus points out that he sees him there, and then that his sight, then the big difference, obviously, than the action, is of the two other characters. He doesn't say this, but the very next thing he says about the Samaritan is he took pity on him. And in our context, we got to be really intentional about defining that word, because people can look derogatorily at that word when that's the same type of root that's when Jesus is moved to compassion.
He cared.
He
cared.
Right. But it's interesting to me that the man approaches him with this cerebral question, like, what do I have to do to inherit? And then he's trying to trick Jesus and trap him, the text says. He's going to go tit for tat with God on an intellectual level. And
Good luck. Good luck.
And he steps up with this, and then Jesus says, now the difference in this peacemaker is he can feel it.
Yeah.
He sees, and then he's moved to compassion. And out of being moved to compassion, he acts in all of these ways.
Yeah.
So Andrew McCourt, one of our pastors at Bayside that's from Ireland, and just got his U.S. citizenship yesterday, by the way.
Yeah.
What a cool thing. But Andrew was talking about this yesterday. He was quoting someone, don't know who it was. Let's just say it's George Bernard Shaw.
Why not?
Why not?
Safe bet.
But he said, if your heart is beating, dadgummit, what did he say? No, I'm kidding. It's like, if your heart is beating, you're alive.
Yep.
If you can feel someone else's pain, you're human.
Yes.
It had this beautiful line.
Wow.
Yes.
But we've all experienced compassion fatigue.
Yep.
And it seems to me in the story, the difference is not just the other two see him, like they walk by and the others beat him up. Like, but what leads him to all these peacemaking actions for this particular context story is that he can feel and be drawn to compassion through the pain of somebody else.
Yep.
So let's all take a roundhouse kick at compassion's need in the middle of this. Like, could the need for compassion to be able to feel, maybe even some practical things on like when we don't, like when we were at compassion fatigue in service professions, we're at most risk of being the ones who lose the feeling of compassion, the thing that arises to alleviate the pain and suffering of someone else. But let's take the roundhouse kick as we close this thing out on compassion's role in peacemaking.
Well, we walk with people a lot, and I think that in the culture we're in, I would just say this. You are absolutely to have compassion and empathy, but you are not built to carry the burden of everything that's coming at you.
Absolutely.
And the unique challenge of our day is the amount of voices that are coming at us that it's very interesting. You either go callous or you just go burn out.
Yeah.
And so we now are getting reports of earthquakes in India, famines, in countries in Africa, division, shootings in Chicago, a kidnapping over there. We're just not, I think it's why we have to know our assignment and go like, I actually am not built to carry all of this.
You're not God.
And I can actually care, but not carry it. There's some things I'm called to carry.
That's right.
And so that's why this pressure though, and anybody listening right now, there is so much pressure people feel that if I don't post, I'm praying for India, and I'm like, I actually don't believe you're praying for India. I just think you actually just feel pressure to post unless people think you won't care.
Yes.
But here's the reality: you're not called to carry everything. You're not called to carry everything. So just wherever you're at, care and walk with people and empathy. But I think we actually get compassion fatigue because we're carrying things we're just not meant to carry, and we don't actually know. We don't feel permission to go like, oh, somebody's carrying that, but it's not me. And that doesn't mean you're cold and callous.
No.
Yeah. Love it.
Thank you.
The question is like, what's in front of me right now? What's knocking on my door? What am I seeing? And then what can I engage? I can't engage with all of that I see, but I can engage with this right here and go, oh gosh, this must be an assignment from God to me right now.
It's this idea of we haven't been entrusted with the world.
Yes.
We've been entrusted with our world.
Yes.
And there is this, and together,
such a smart way to say it.
we are surrounding the world, but individually, social media, news, satellites, we're not in the garden. We were not created to have a global understanding of everything that's happening all at once, right?
And conflict.
Yes, we're not created to be able to comprehend all the things. That's right. But we are called and entrusted and invited to what is in front of us. Care about that thing and receive that strength. I think the way to give and not receive this compassion fatigue is what we were talking about with the idea of tapping in. It's not, I just have a belief in God, I happen to be a Christ follower, a Christian. It's this tap in. God, I need the God of peace in my life. I don't want to just go to church and just kind of be a spiritual person. I want to experience your peace so I can give peace. And we cannot give what we don't receive.
Right.
And so I think for all of us, pastors included, because we can become professional Christians that know how to pray. We know how to do all the things in public, but in private, it's that tap in peace to become and to receive from God so that we can give back to God that world that he's entrusted us with.
It's some years ago, but when I was working in the corporate world, the word compassion kept coming up in various settings as people would talk to me, and Lorraine, you just have so much compassion. And it was actually a clue God was giving me about where he was going to be taking me. And then he put a call on my life to lavish those in need with Christ-like compassion and servant care. That became then the rudder for me that would steer me when opportunities would come up. Does that fit within that? And so when the door opened for me to leave the corporate world and become a community care pastor, I thought, wow, okay, this is great. This is right in that wheelhouse. It's a fit. And compassion means to suffer with. And so when I would sit with people in my office that would come to meet with me as a pastor, I put this pressure on myself to, gosh, I need to do something to make it worth their time to be here. You know, I need to make something happen so they walk out feeling like this was worth the trip. I need to fix whatever is going on.
It was worth their tithe.
Right. Yes, exactly. So I wound up in performance mode of wanting to, you know, like manufacture peace in their situation rather than just to join them where they are, come alongside them in the pit, point out the furnishings, breathe some hope into that because of the suffering I've been through myself and the faithfulness of God I've seen there. Because I learned pretty quickly that does lead to burnout as you're trying to fix everyone. And also you are taking away an opportunity for God to actually work in that suffering that someone is going through. And, you know, we can just come alongside and breathe peace into that. And we have to be so careful that our compassion dance card isn't full all the time.
Great word.
Because, you know, we're always feeling like every problem is one for us to fix. But instead, these are people and opportunities that God puts in front of us to steward well. As we ourselves drink from a well of peace in God.
That's a great word.
Love it.
I love that. It's beautiful. I think for me, it's been recognizing that nothing happens by accident, that there's a divine plan at play and work that God is orchestrating through his Holy Spirit every day. And he's calling me, he's calling you, he's calling you on these assignments of specific people, right? And so it's in my best interest to be paying attention and be intentional and prayerful as I go into my day and hear from his Spirit, because sometimes we're taking other people's opportunities away, that he's got someone in the wings he's going to use because we're operating in just mode, you know, flesh mode or whatever it is. And so those are my best days. There's alignment, there's peace, there's ease. Like I'm not exhausted at the end of the day. It's exciting, and I can tell the difference on the days where I'm just saying yes because I'm people pleasing. I don't want to disappoint, and so I think for me, I'm grateful that I have that experience with the Lord to know what it feels like when I'm really walking in the assignment that He has for me. It's in the unseen. No one sees often. It's interceding and target for someone, and Him remind me one day you're going to hear how that prayer was answered. But those are my best days. I work in we work in churches where people are continually wanting, time with us, prayers. They want to bring us into their circumstances. And I think for me, it's not I'm one person, but how do I mobilize other people to be compassionate and aware of how we can love and care for one another.
We got to break the 80-20 principle in the church. In all honesty, that principle I think is not. I think it's real. I don't think it's kingdom. Getting more people, actually the body of Christ carrying this stuff, I think is so key.
And the other thing too is I hear a lot of times, well, I'm just not a compassionate person. If you have Jesus in you, anything that Jesus was and is who we are. And so it's not an Enneagram number. It's not a personality trait. It's not a bent. No, we are called to be compassionate, and sometimes in our weakness, and it doesn't make sense to us, this is where God shows up the most.
We don't get to opt out. We do
get
not
to
get to opt out.
It's actually not true either.
Right, exactly. Yes.
I'm not a compassionate person. That's just not like
biggest cop out ever.
Well, I think a lot of people leave it to the care ministry, to the pastors, to the chaplains.
He just got hired at a church. We need to not expose him fully about his lack of compassion for people. He doesn't even like people.
Right. That's it. Guys, thank you all so much for being on this. Like, I think
really,
my final piece of that is I'm so grateful for all of you.
Yeah.
What you do in the community and who you are and how you're championing this peacemaking. I think I'd close it with this, that I find it very intentional, as God is, that when He would pass in front of Moses and say, "This is what my name is," He would say, "Yahweh, Yahweh," and the first word out of His mouth would be the compassionate.
Yeah.
And then goes on to say gracious, mercy, all of the other things that He says. But I think that kind of key in that is God is compassionate, long suffering with us.
Yes.
So as He's producing these things in us, transforming us, conforming us into the image of Christ, from the peace within us, peace with God, and then peace outside, and making sure we don't carry. I just think this is so full of gold. I'm so appreciative of you guys for being on this. And I think the only way to end this is Brandon to say the words you said you were going to say at the beginning of this podcast. 2 words.
I disagree.
Thank you.